Before Jerusalem became the sacred city of Israel, it already existed, inhabited by a mysterious and resilient people, the Jebusites. Who were they? Where did they come from? And why, even in the face of the great conquests of Israel, did they remain in that land for such a long time? The Jebusites were not just any people in the Bible. They built fortresses, challenged armies, and resisted until the reign of David. But in the end, their fate was sealed in a surprising way. In this video, we will explore how this people influenced the history of Jerusalem before it became the city of God. Get ready to uncover a rarely explored story in the Bible, yet essential for understanding the past of the Promised Land. Long before Jerusalem became the sacred city we know today, its lands were inhabited by a strong and determined people, the Jebusites. But who were they? Where did they come from? And why did they become known in history for their unwavering resistance? To understand their journey, we need to go back to ancient times, shortly after the great flood that covered the earth. The Bible tells us that Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and from them came the great nations. Among the descendants of Ham was Canaan, Genesis chapter 10, verse 6, from whose lineage came various peoples who inhabited the land of Canaan, the same land that in the future God promised to Abraham and his descendants. The Jebusites were among these peoples. More than just inhabitants, they were skilled warriors, strategists, and talented builders. The Bible mentions their presence in the region multiple times, always highlighting their strength and resilience. They were not nomads in search of temporary shelter. On the contrary, they built fortified cities and developed advanced defenses, becoming a great obstacle for the Israelites arriving to take possession of the Promised Land. The center of their power was the city of Jebus, located exactly where, centuries later, Jerusalem would rise as the heart of the Judeo-Christian faith. But at that time, Jebus was an almost impenetrable fortress. Situated high in the mountains and surrounded by deep valleys, its strategic position made it difficult for enemy armies to invade. Moreover, the Jebusites were masters in the art of building walls and defensive systems. Their fortifications were so well designed that they remained strong for generations, withstanding countless attacks. The Jebusites were not alone in Canaan. The region was inhabited by several powerful peoples, such as the Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and the Canaanites themselves. However, the Jebusites stood out for their ability to resist and their defensive strategies. While many of these peoples quickly fell to the advance of the Israelites led by Joshua, the Jebusites remained firm, protected by their fortifications and their deep knowledge of the land they called home. In addition to being skilled warriors, the Jebusites had a culture deeply rooted in their religiosity. They worshipped pagan gods, believing that these deities granted them protection and strength. To them, Jebus was not just a fortified city, it was a symbol of tradition, a sanctuary that represented their power and identity. Proud of their heritage, they were willing to fight to preserve their land and history, facing any enemy who dared to challenge them. After many years of wandering in the desert, the Israelites finally arrived in the Promised Land. The hope of fulfilling the promise made by God to their ancestors was about to come true. However, there was an obstacle. The land was already occupied by ancient and well-structured civilizations. Among them, the Jebusites stood out because they inhabited one of the most strategic fortresses in Canaan, the city of Jebus. Joshua, the leader who took on the mission of guiding the Israelites after Moses, marched with his army to conquer the land. Under God's guidance, he brought down walls, defeated kings, and took possession of cities that seemed impossible to overthrow. Jericho fell before divine power, Ai was destroyed, and many other territories were conquered. But the Jebusites, they did not surrender easily. They resisted bravely, holding their position in Jebus and challenging the Israelites for many years. The Bible records that despite the numerous victories of Joshua and the Israelites over the peoples of Canaan, the Jebusites remained firm in their resistance. In the book of Joshua, chapter 15, verse 63, it is written, "The sons of Judah could not drive out the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So the Jebusites dwell with the sons of Judah in Jerusalem to this day." This simple passage reveals a fundamental detail. While many cities in Canaan were taken by the Israelites, Jerusalem remained under Jebusite control for many years. But what made this people one of the most difficult to defeat? The answer lies in both the geographical location and the infrastructure of Jebus. Unlike other cities in the region, which were more exposed and vulnerable to attacks, Jebus was strategically built on steep mountains and surrounded by deep valleys, making any invasion attempt extremely difficult. Additionally, the Jebusites were masters in the construction of fortifications, erecting strong walls and defensive systems that challenged any invading army. Another factor that contributed to the Jebusites' resistance was the presence of natural water sources within the city. In an era when many cities fell due to a lack of supplies during prolonged sieges, Jebus had a sophisticated underground water supply system, ensuring access to water even in times of war. This advantage allowed its inhabitants to withstand long periods without surrendering. And that is exactly what happened. The Israelites surrounded the city, launched attacks, and tried in various ways to expel the Jebusites, but they could not fully take Jebus. Even in the face of the offensives from God's people, the Jebusites remained firm, holding their control over that strategic land for many years. Time passed, and even after the death of Joshua, the Jebusites continued to maintain their dominance over Jerusalem. During the period of the Judges, the situation remained unchanged. The Bible records in Judges chapter 1, verse 21, "The sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So the Jebusites dwell with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day." This reveals an astonishing fact. Despite the conquest of the Promised Land, Jerusalem still represented a challenge for the Israelites. The Jebusites not only resisted expulsion attempts, but continued living in the city, coexisting with the descendants of Abraham. But why was this so significant? After all, many cities had already been conquered, and the Israelites were established in much of the land. The problem lay in the divine command. God had instructed that all pagan nations be completely expelled. However, the Jebusites remained, and with them their customs and idolatrous beliefs. Their constant presence meant that Israel was surrounded by pagan practices and the temptation to stray from the worship of the true God. And, as history would show, this influence would lead the people of Israel to stumble on multiple occasions. Beyond the spiritual aspect, there was a strategic issue. Jerusalem was not just any city. Whoever controlled it would have great dominance over the surrounding region. Allowing the Jebusites to remain there was a mistake that would cost the Israelites dearly and would only be corrected many years later. For generations, the Jebusites defied the Israelites and kept their fortress intact in the heart of Canaan. Jebus, as it was called, seemed impossible to conquer. No leader before had been able to take it completely. Joshua tried, but he failed. For many years, the Israelites lived alongside the Jebusites, but never truly subdued them. Protected by towering walls and surrounded by deep valleys, Jerusalem remained an almost impenetrable fortress, a symbol of the Jebusites' resistance and a constant reminder of the unfinished challenge left for future generations of Israel. Then came David, the young shepherd who defeated Goliath and was chosen by God to rule Israel. But he was not just a brave warrior. He was also a shrewd strategist and a man of faith. And he had a clear goal in mind: to conquer Jerusalem. After the death of Saul, David finally ascended to the throne, but initially, he ruled only Judah from Hebron for 7 years. However, the kingdom remained divided. If he wanted to unite all the tribes under one government, he needed a strategic capital, a place that would symbolize the unity of Israel. And Jerusalem was that place. Situated in the heart of the Israelite territory, between the tribes of the north and the south, it was the perfect choice to become the political and spiritual center of the nation. But there was a great obstacle. The Jebusites still controlled the city and had no intention of surrendering it. They relied on their towering walls and the city's privileged geographical position, which for centuries had made any attempt at conquest impossible. When they heard that David was marching with his army toward Jerusalem, they mocked him, certain that their fortress would never be taken. The Bible records in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 6, "The Jebusites said to David, 'You will never enter here. Even the blind and the lame can repel you.'" They thought that David would never be able to invade the city. The Jebusites were so confident that they declared they did not even need warriors to defend themselves. According to them, even the blind and the lame would be enough to stop David. For generations, the city had remained unshaken, and they believed that this would never change. But what the Jebusites did not know was that David was not like the leaders who came before him. He would not attempt a conventional approach by attacking the walls head-on. Instead, he studied the city carefully and searched for a weakness, and he found one: the underground water system. The Bible states that David instructed his men to enter the city through a water tunnel. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 8. Jerusalem had an underground tunnel that connected the city to the Gihon spring, located outside the walls. This system allowed the residents to access water without leaving the safety of the fortress, preventing enemy attacks. It was in this detail that David saw the key to conquering Jerusalem. Without drawing attention, his most skilled warriors infiltrated the underground tunnel, climbing through hidden passages and emerging directly inside the city. By the time the Jebusites realized what was happening, it was already too late. The fortress that had remained impenetrable for centuries was now under attack from within. David and his men took control of the highest point of the city, the fortress of Zion. From there he established his capital and gave the city a new name, the City of David. Finally, Jerusalem was in the hands of God's people. For many years, the city had been seen as an impenetrable fortress, a bastion of the Jebusites that defied any attempt at conquest. But with intelligence, strategy, and God's guidance, David achieved what no one before him had. However, this victory was only the beginning of Jerusalem's transformation. The city, which had once been a place of pagan worship and a symbol of resistance against Israel, would soon become the heart of the faith of God's chosen people. But how did this transition happen? How did Jerusalem go from being an enemy stronghold to becoming the political and spiritual center of Israel? The answer lies in the reign of David and his son Solomon, and in the great changes that would take place after the conquest. As soon as David established his rule over Jerusalem, he did not waste time. He strengthened its defenses, expanded the walls, and built his royal residence there. But he knew that Jerusalem could not be just the seat of government. The city needed to be more than that. It had to become the spiritual center of the nation. To establish Jerusalem as the spiritual center of Israel, David made a crucial decision: to bring the Ark of the Covenant to the city, the symbol of God's presence among his people. Until that moment, the Ark had been kept in different places without a permanent home. David wanted to change that. He organized a grand celebration filled with praises, sacrifices, and dances. The Bible describes that David, overcome with joy, led the Ark to Jerusalem with enthusiasm and devotion. 2 Samuel chapter 6, verses 12 and 15. The arrival of the Ark marked a new chapter in the city's history. Jerusalem was no longer just an ancient Jebusite fortress. Now it was the place chosen by God to manifest his presence among Israel. However, David knew that Jerusalem needed something even greater. His desire was to build a temple for the Lord, a sacred place where the people could worship him and offer sacrifices. But God did not allow him to carry out this work. Since David had been a man of war, shedding much blood in battles, the mission of building the temple was reserved for his son Solomon. Solomon, known for his wisdom and wealth, ascended to the throne and was given the responsibility of constructing the first temple of God. But where should this monumental work be built? The answer lay in a very special place, Mount Moriah, a land that had previously belonged to a Jebusite named Ornan or Araunah. The story of this mountain is narrated in 2 Samuel chapter 24, verses 18 through 25. It all began when David made a grave mistake by ordering a census of the people without God's direction. As a consequence, a devastating plague struck Israel. Repentant, David cried out for mercy, and God responded through the prophet Gad, commanding him to build an altar on Ornan's land where the Jebusite was threshing wheat. David went to Ornan and offered him money for the land. The Jebusite, as a sign of respect for the king, wanted to give the land as a gift. But David refused, declaring a remarkable statement: "No, I will pay the full price. I will not offer to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing. 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 24. With this, David purchased the land, built the altar, and offered sacrifices to the Lord. God accepted the offering, and the plague that afflicted Israel came to an end. Years later, it was precisely on this same mountain that Solomon built the magnificent temple of the Lord, establishing Jerusalem as the center of worship to Yahweh and solidifying it as the holy city. The construction of the temple brought a profound transformation to Jerusalem. The city that had once symbolized the resistance of a pagan people now became the place where God manifested his presence in a unique way. From that moment on, Jerusalem began to receive thousands of pilgrims every year, Israelites coming from all parts to worship in the temple. The sacred festivals, such as Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, began to be celebrated there, reinforcing the city's role as the spiritual heart of Israel. The name of Jerusalem became irrevocably linked to the glory of God, fulfilling the promise made to Abraham. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. But this change went far beyond the physical structure of the city. It was a spiritual transformation. Jerusalem, which once housed pagan worship and resisted God's people, had now become the center of Israel's faith, and in the future would be the stage for the greatest event in human history. The journey of Jerusalem teaches us something extraordinary. God can transform any situation, even those that seem to be against him. The city that once opposed Israel became the dwelling place of the living God. Mount Moriah, which once belonged to a Jebusite, became the site of the Lord's temple. What seemed like an insurmountable obstacle was transformed into a landmark of divine purpose. But this story was far from over. Centuries later, an even more significant event would take place within these walls. Jesus Christ, the promised Messiah, would enter Jerusalem triumphantly, riding on a donkey, fulfilling the prophecies. It was in this same city that he would be betrayed, judged, and crucified. On Mount Calvary, he would shed his blood for the redemption of humanity. It was there that he would be buried, and on the third day he would conquer death, bringing salvation not only to Israel, but to all nations. Jerusalem, which had once been a Jebusite fortress, became the stage for the greatest act of love and redemption in history. The Jebusites were a people known for their strength and resilience. For centuries they established themselves in Jerusalem, fortified their walls, and faced great challenges without ever surrendering easily. Their city was considered impenetrable. Not even Joshua's army managed to completely drive them out. But as happens with all civilizations, the time came when their rule came to an end. The turning point came with the arrival of King David. When he conquered Jerusalem, the Jebusites lost their independence and were gradually assimilated into the people of Israel. Over time, they ceased to exist as a distinct group. However, this did not mean that they were forgotten. On the contrary, their history was preserved and recorded in the scriptures. The Jebusites were not destroyed like many other peoples who opposed Israel, such as the Amorites and the Midianites. The Bible does not describe a brutal extermination when David took Jerusalem. Instead, the city was conquered with intelligence and strategy, and the Jebusites who remained there were integrated into Israelite society. Some Jebusites continued to live under the reign of David and Solomon. One of the most well-known was Ornan, or Araunah, the owner of land on Mount Moriah. It was at this location that David, following divine guidance, built an altar to the Lord. 2 Samuel chapter 24, verses 18 through 25. Later, this same mountain would become the site where Solomon would build the Temple of Jerusalem, transforming the ancient Jebusite fortress into the center of worship to God. The Jebusites may have disappeared as a people, but their name and their city were eternalized in the history of Israel. Jerusalem, which once symbolized resistance against God's people, became the most important city of monotheistic faith, a meeting place between God and humanity. The most remarkable thing about the Jebusites is not the fact that they ceased to exist, but rather the transformation of their city. The place that was once a pagan stronghold and an impenetrable fortress became the heart of Judeo-Christian faith, a living testimony of how God can transform any place and any story to fulfill his purpose. Jerusalem, which once belonged to a pagan people and resisted the advance of Israel, was chosen by God to become the political and spiritual capital of his chosen people. The site where Solomon would build the magnificent temple, the center of worship to God, the setting for the most significant moments of Christian faith, including the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. The Jebusites disappeared over time, but Jerusalem remained. The city that once took pride in its resistance against Israel became the ultimate symbol of God's presence among men. And this transformation carries a profound meaning. God could have chosen any place to be the capital of his people, but he chose precisely the city that resisted him the most. He took a symbol of human pride and turned it into a testimony of his glory and redemption. The story of the Jebusites teaches us valuable spiritual lessons. God's plans always come to pass. For centuries, the Jebusites resisted, trusting in their walls and strategic position. However, at the time appointed by God, Jerusalem was taken and transformed into the place where he would manifest his presence. This reminds us that, just as he changed the destiny of this city, he can also transform any heart and any circumstance, no matter how difficult it may seem. God uses even what seems to be against him to fulfill his purposes. Who could have imagined that a pagan fortress would become the heart of monotheistic faith? God has the power to take what seems lost and redefine it for his glory. Confidence without God leads to downfall. The Jebusites believed that their city was impenetrable, that their natural defenses made them invincible. But when God decided to act, no wall was strong enough to stop him. This reminds us that there is no real security outside the will of the Lord. Centuries later, after David's conquest, Jerusalem remained the epicenter of great biblical events. It was there that Jesus lived, taught, performed miracles, and ultimately gave his life for the salvation of humanity. The city that once defied God's people became the place where he revealed his greatest plan of redemption. The city that once belonged to the Jebusites became the setting for some of the most significant moments in human history. The triumphal entry of Jesus, acclaimed by the people as the Messiah, the crucifixion of Christ, the fulfillment of God's perfect plan of redemption, the resurrection of Jesus, the ultimate victory over sin and death. But the story of Jerusalem is not over yet. The Bible reveals that this city will be the stage for future events, and in the end times, it will be the place where God will manifest his glory in a magnificent way. The Jebusites may have disappeared as a people, but they were never forgotten. The city they once built became the most mentioned city in the Bible, and a religious center not only for Judaism and Christianity, but also for Islam. However, the true legacy of the Jebusites is not in the gods they worshipped, nor in the resistance they offered to Israel, but in the city they built, a city that God chose to transform. What was once a symbol of human pride became a living testimony of God's glory. Jerusalem, which was once a Jebusite fortress, is now an eternal symbol of faith, hope, and God's divine promise for all humanity. Now, I want to hear from you. Did you already know the story of the Jebusites in the Bible? Write your thoughts in the comments, share this message with more people, leave a like on the video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next content. May God bless your life.